going back in time this week, all the way back to the Old Testament, all the way back to the first book of the Bible, all the way back to Abraham, all the way back to the first promise that God made with Abraham. Actually, it was before Abraham even went by Abraham. He called himself Abram. We're going all the way back to the beginning of God's great big rescue plan for his people. Here in the first book of the Bible, called Genesis, we read some of our favorite Bible stories. We have creation, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark. It's also the book of the Bible where we meet Abraham. You can learn more about Abraham in an upcoming episode of All About the Bible. Abraham at this point in his life is a very old man. He had lived a good life, he had a great wife named Sarah, and he had a great relationship with God. But unfortunately, Abraham doesn't have any kids, and that makes him really sad. So one day, God comes to Abraham and says, listen, I'm gonna make you a promise. I know that you and Sarah have always wanted to be parents, and I'm gonna make that happen. And Abraham believes God, even though the idea that he might still be a dad one day is completely ridiculous. I mean, Abraham is old, like really, really old. Anyways, God says, Abraham, look at the sky. Count the number of stars. This is the number of descendants you're gonna have. So what God is saying is that not only will you be a dad, but you're gonna have this huge family one day. Psst, come here, come here. No, seriously, come here. I have a secret to tell you. We are part of Abraham's family. Wild, right? Okay, so back to the story. Abraham listens as God tells him to count the stars. But then he does something that not very many people in the Bible do. Abraham questions God. It says here in verse 8 that he says, how can I be sure that this is true? Whoa. Hold on a second. Abraham is asking God to give him a sign. He's asking God to make him a promise. Can he even do that? Well, God responds and says, I'm gonna make you a promise. Okay, he doesn't really say that, but these are what his actions say. See, way back in these times, when someone would want to make a promise with another person, they would make what was called a covenant, and they would gather certain animals together. And they would use them for a sacrifice. Then they would walk through the path of animals, and the promise that they made would be sealed. It was kind of like a super fancy pinky swear. So God says to Abraham, go and get the animals for the sacrifice. We're gonna make a promise to each other. And Abraham obeys and gets everything together. Now, normally at this point, both people would be making the promise and both would walk through the path. This would symbolize that the promise was between two people. Think about it this way. Maybe your mom promises to take you out for a tasty treat if you promise to complete all of your homework on time this week. See, you have to keep your side of the promise, and then your mom has to keep her end up as well. This is how we work together to keep a promise. All right, back to the story. It says here in verse 12 that after the sun set, Abraham fell into a deep sleep. Uh-oh, how can Abraham walk the path and make a promise to God if he's asleep, right? But that's exactly the point. It says here that God appeared and passed through the path himself. So the promise was made by God alone. And this means that no matter what Abraham did, God would keep up his end of the deal. No matter how many times Abraham messed up or disobeyed God, he would still receive all of what God had promised to give him. This story is important to understand for a few reasons. One, it's super important to understand that we can never make promises to God. We might try really hard, but in the end, we always end up messing up or making a mistake. But that's okay, because God is always forgiving and he keeps his promises to us and he never messes up. This story is also important to understand because it's the beginning of our story with God. In this promise, God agrees to stay committed to Abraham and take care of him, all of his family, all of his descendants. Remember what I told you? We are Abraham's family. We all are. So way back, thousands and thousands of years ago, when God was talking to Abraham out in the middle of the desert on a starry night, God made a promise that he will always take care of you. How cool is that? These stories are super fun for us to read and learn, but they're also really important because they're our story too. Think of Abraham like your great, 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 great grandpa. And with that, let's jump into our Bible memory verse. A blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Genesis 15:17-18. Now I'll take some words away. Keep following along and we'll memorize this verse together. A blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Genesis 15:17-18. A blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Genesis 15:17-18. A blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Genesis 15:17-18. A blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Genesis 15:17-18. A blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Genesis 15:17-18. Here comes your challenge for this week. Challenge 1. On a clear evening, go outside and count how many stars you can see. Then, with your parents' help, go online and learn how many stars are in our galaxy. Are you amazed? Share some of your info with us on Sunday. Challenge 2. Using the words and the story from Genesis chapter 15, rewrite the words to the song Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to create your own song that tells the story of God's covenant with Abram. Share your song with us on Sunday. Thanks for joining me this week. Stay tuned for the announcements at the end of the video, and I'll see you Sunday.